personally, I think that the forecast was just much too optimistic.
We have a new spokesperson for the Corbynite left in a man called Gary Stevenson, who's been on the IEA podcast.
We've already got a big problem. Tens of thousands of millionaires leaving the UK. And we have a greater exodus than any country except China of rich people.
Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast. I'm Colin Price, Director of Communications here. Today, as usual, I'm joined by our Executive Director, Tom Clougherty, and our Editorial Director, Kristian Niemietz. Now, before we dive in, which we will do very shortly, do subscribe to our Substack at insider.iea.org.uk. There you can get everything that we put out, including our publications, our blog posts, our videos, and much, much more. So, this week, big week for think tanks and Westminster, because it was the spring statement, the Chancellor's budget, not budget, whatever you want to call it. She announced updates to the growth forecasts and how she was going to rediscover that fiscal headroom that she had lost since the budget. Tom, what's your headline takeaway?
I mean, I didn't find it that exciting, to be honest with you. I mean, like most of these things, everything had been trailed in advance. Actually, when you get into the nuts and bolts of it, it wasn't that dramatic. But basically, the story was, as many people had suspected, the economy is going to grow by about half as much this year as the OBR had previously thought, so 1% instead of 2%. Obviously, that and some other factors has an impact on the government's tax take and therefore the deficit. And of course, you have to understand the entire goal of fiscal policy in Britain is to hit a moving target, which is always 5 years away, that the current budget has to be in surplus. Now, there's nothing wrong with the current budget being in surplus in 5 years' time. It'd be quite nice if that was the case. It'd be quite nice if it happened sooner. But it is strange the way we've made this just sort of the one sacred fact of British fiscal policy, and everything, these spring statements, budgets, are kind of a dance around that figure. So I think what the Chancellor was confronted with is that at the autumn budget, she had left herself 9.9 billion of headroom in 5 years' time. That's how much the current budget was going to be in surplus by. Unfortunately, because of adverse economic news, that had all disappeared, and then some. So she was left with a deficit in 5 years' time of 4.5 billion or something. And so changes were announced, which put everything back to the 9.9 billion of headroom that was there to begin with. So you've seen some welfare cuts, and they seem to me to have been well judged, although arguably I think you could go further. And I think you could focus on some bigger picture reforms there, and that would be quite helpful. They've trimmed some departmental budgets, so not cuts exactly, because the spending plans were quite generous, quite high levels of spending, but they cut those back a little bit. They're launching yet another tax avoidance crackdown, although I have read that this time it's serious. And then they've
never really been tried.
No, never. And then they've been able to factor in some positive economic effects from planning reform over the course of the 5 years. So that's good as well. I think they end up with a 0.2% uplift in GDP because they're relaxing planning constraints a little bit. Now, what's the end result of all of this? We're pretty much back where we started. We've had some good welfare reforms. Spending has changed a little bit, and there's some nice supply side stuff being worked into the mix. I think ultimately, though, the Chancellor still has very little headroom. It's about a third of what previous Chancellors have generally allowed themselves. And it's quite possible that the economic news will continue to get worse. You can look at tariffs, which we're going to talk about. You can look at interest rates. I mean, there's a whole host of things that could knock the economic trajectory that the OBR has sketched out off course. And I think the crucial one here is that the OBR is still fairly optimistic about productivity growth bouncing back in the UK, as they have been for about 15 years, about as long as they've been around. Now, they're predicting that going forward, productivity is going to rise by about 1% a year. Doesn't sound like much. That's half what we had before the financial crisis, but it's also double what we've actually managed since the financial crisis. And it's not clear that there are plans that will make that happen. It seems to be a little bit of wishful thinking. So I suppose if there's something I can hope for from this, it's that the government will see that 0.2% of GDP uplift they're getting from some, fairly minor planning reforms. They'll see that they're still in a pretty tight spot fiscally and that they're exposed to any kind of deterioration in the economic news. They will know that they got in massive trouble last autumn for raising taxes, and they promised not to do it again. we'll see. I think there's going to be a lot of speculation over the next 6 months saying the government will have to raise taxes. What taxes are they going to raise? That will be kind of quite confidence sapping, I think, for the private sector as well. But my hope, as I say, is that the government looks at this situation. They look at the little uplift they've got from the planning reforms and they think what we need to do is go hell for leather on supply side reforms, which don't have a fiscal cost, but which the OBR will score as improving GDP growth over the next 5 years. And that will mean we can stick to our fiscal rules. Now, just worth noting, finally, for all of that, the OBR did not score the Employment Rights Bill, which is going through Parliament at the moment. And chances are that will have a negative effect on labour supply, a depressing effect on economic growth over the long run. I don't know what the magnitude of that would be. I think that they will probably be modelling that next time around when they do the forecast in the autumn. Nevertheless, that's a potential headwind which is going to have to be overcome by better reforms elsewhere.
That's all bang on. And I think what the really interesting point in there, and Kristian, I'll turn to you on this, is what Tom just mentioned about the fact that, and Rachel Reeves made a big thing of this in her speech, the positive effects on growth of the planning reform. She didn't pull a rabbit out, but she tried to make this the sort of rabbit in terms of how she structured the speech. 0.2% growth in 5 years' time, and it didn't cost a penny, effectively. Mm-hmm. And we're all sat here on Lord North Street saying, shock. We've been saying this for a long time. But do you think, first of all, are you surprised? I'm guessing not. Second of all, do you think we can be hopeful of more?
I'm not surprised, but this is the first time that I've seen the OBR trying to put a number on supply-side reforms of that nature. And yes, in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't sound like much, especially in the context of the more near-term forecast being revised downwards by a full percentage point. But so having a fifth of a percentage point added to the growth rate in 5 years' time, well, that doesn't sound fantastic. But nonetheless, if we bear in mind that this is completely risk-free, this is cost-free, this is at the stroke of a pen, they've managed to increase the medium-term growth rate by a fifth of a percentage point. So this would be the equivalent of, say, finding a pile of money lying around on the pavement. And if somebody who earns £30,000 a year finds £60 on the pavement, they're not going to say, oh no, this is just 0.2% of my annual salary. This is not going to make me rich. I better leave it lying there. I think that person would be very positively surprised, and they would maybe return to the place where they found those pound notes. And I think this is the lesson here, that this is what this should show, this OBR report, is that it is very easy to increase growth if you want to. In this case, these are supply-side reforms that are not particularly ambitious, the path that I've modeled here. This is really just the increase in the housing targets and the very minor revisions to the greenbelt boundaries. That on its own, that's enough to add 0.2% to the growth rate and to the annual rate. And they are also projecting, this is perhaps more interesting, that they're saying this is just from the additional construction activity. If we look a bit further ahead in the 2030s, next decade, it is quite possible that these reforms will also lead to more people moving into the high productivity areas and increased agglomeration benefits. And this is harder to model, but they're saying the 0.2%, that could easily double. And this is all on the basis of fairly minor reforms that have been announced so far. So this shows if you really went for that, we now have the numbers for it. It's now quite clear. This is the way to increase growth. It is possible. It isn't that hard. It isn't like splitting the atom. It can be done, and on a relatively minor scale, it is already being done. So more of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And on the wider sort of context, so growth forecasts for this year have been halved. And then going forward, they've been uprated, but they're still below 2% until 29-30. And Rachel Reeves was quite keen to point out that the halving of growth forecast was because of global things, but seemed to be quite keen to take credit for the uprate of the next few years. But that's politics for you. How much do we think the sort of halving of growth forecasts for this year are because of the budget last year and things that this government has done? How much is it because of things previous governments have done, and how much is it things that are happening in the world that are out of this government's or any government's control in the UK?
I mean, there's things happening in the world which are economic headwinds. Can't ignore those. There are things the government have done which I think will have undermined the UK's economic performance a little bit, like the raise or the announcement that they're going to increase employers' national insurance contributions, various other things as well. Personally, I think that the forecast was just much too optimistic, and that sadly, probably
productivity.
Well, yeah, and I think basically 1% is probably our realistic trend growth rate at the moment, based on the mix of policies that we have and the underlying fundamentals. Now, it doesn't have to be that way. And I thought it was quite interesting. We hosted an event with John Moynihan this week about his books, Return to Growth, and they feature some quite interesting economic modelling and, what they come up with. And of course, look, there's this model over here, there's that model over here. You're kind of comparing theoretical scenarios. So it's not like you can say this is absolutely what's going to happen, right? But nevertheless, I think it's interesting. Their modelling suggested in his books that basically the UK economy is going to grow at like 0.7, 0.8% a year. In per capita terms, basically going to be flat where we are at the moment. He thinks with spending cuts and tax cuts of around 100 billion, you can add a percentage point a year to GDP growth. He thinks with regulatory reform, you can add another percentage point a year to GDP growth. So you can get from a sort of 1% economy to a 2% economy to a 3% economy, which I think is really where we ought to be and where I think we could be with good economic policies, not easy economic policies, things that are going to be controversial, things that are going to take time and serious thinking to put in place. But I do think that it's a plausible scenario. But right now we are a 1% a year economy, more or less. And I think there may be years where we surprise on the upside, but without serious change, and I always think this is funny when the economic statistics come out and people are like, oh, well, actually, no, they said we shrunk by 0.1%. Actually, we grew by 0.1%. Hooray. It's like, no, it's just crap either way, right? These are rounding errors anyway, and they often get revised away. The point is we are stagnating, and without serious change, we will continue to stagnate. And you can argue about percentage points here and there, but that's the raw fact of our situation. And with an aging population, chances are it only gets worse on current policy setting.
Well, I was about to say, how much of that growth...
cheerful for you.
Yeah, great. But how much of that, even that 1% trend growth, is swallowed up, but just by the fact that we have an increasing amount of people who are mainly pensioners?
Yeah. I mean, one very good economist has told me you basically need about 0.75% a year growth just to keep up with the cost of population aging. So no one's actually going to feel any richer in that scenario. You're just covering your costs. So really, you need to go well beyond that to start feeling like actually we're making progress. Actually, living standards are improving and everything else, and we're just not in that state at the moment.
Yeah, the bigger picture clearly is. So, of course, we can argue about how much of the current revision, the downward revision, is due to Trump's tariffs and all that, and global factors. Could all well be that in this particular case, yes, for the annual, for the near-term figures, that really is due to factors outside of the government's control. But we have barely grown since 2007, and that was when Donald Trump was still just a showman, a TV personality. Yeah. So yeah, that is the bigger picture here. But it is, of course, in the near term, it is true that I guess it's not so much that the tariff announcements themselves are terrible, but also that he keeps changing his tariff policy every 10 minutes. So he's been going from, I think initially he wanted some across-the-board tariff on pretty much everything, and then he started to single out particular countries, and now he's starting to single out particular industries. So it is more that kind of jumping back and forth between completely different forms of tariff policy, and nobody knows how do we prepare for this. What is the policy going to be ultimately?
So let's just focus in on the tariffs now then, because of how live the issue is. On the 2nd of April, which I think is Wednesday, the US is going to impose 25% tariffs on sort of cars and light vans, effectively, so automotive tariffs. I think the US is our second biggest export market for cars and automotive vehicles. But because of this, his sort of erratic nature around it, there are efforts ongoing, and the Treasury may be hopeful that they can negotiate themselves a carve-out, because Trump keeps changing his mind, keeps looking at different countries and changing which tariffs, and maybe they're pushing to try and to get a carve-out for the UK on whatever grounds possible. But the OBR forecast that these tariffs specifically could cut GDP by 0.6% by 2026, and then if we impose retaliatory tariffs, that could grow to 1% loss of GDP. Retaliatory tariffs, I'm assuming, Tom, you don't think are the way to go.
No, it's people say, we need to defend ourselves. But how are you defending yourself? By making yourself poorer? And it's not like actually this is sort of an equal partnership where if we stand up, America will back down. Right? It just isn't. And I don't think there's any real way to rationalize this. It may be that after the fact, people say, look, President Trump had a really clever plan after all, and it's all worked out for the best. I'll believe that when I see it, because I don't think there's a particular strategy here. What there is a kind of near religious belief that tariffs are good and protectionism is good. Big, beautiful tariffs which are going to make America great. Okay, now, literally no one who understands economics believes this stuff. I don't really think that the smart people around President Trump believe this stuff either. And the whole approach to it is extremely erratic. I think all we can do from the British perspective is say, America's going to do its thing on tariffs. That is clear at this point. We can just stick to the principle that we don't want to impoverish our own consumers. We don't want to harm our own businesses that rely on imported products. We don't want to get into a tit-for-tat escalation here. Just stick to the principle of the thing that trade is mutually beneficial and good, and it's one of the things that makes us better off. And let's do that.
Yeah, and once you go for retaliatory tariffs, you have basically accepted Donald Trump's logic that a tariff is somehow a weapon you can wield against other countries, whereas we should really emphasize that this is primarily the country that imposes tariffs hurts its own consumers. It's not a tax on foreign countries. It's a tax on your own domestic consumers. And, it has some negative spillover effects. It's going to be felt here as well. It's not as if the impact is going to be only within the United States, but nonetheless, the bulk of the impact is going to be felt at home for them, and you can't sensibly retaliate to that by hurting your own consumers, because that's not much of a retaliation. That is purely a sort of self-sabotage.
I mean, it did strike me, people say, you've got to fight fire with fire. Now, if you actually try to fight fire with fire, I think that would be pretty catastrophic, wouldn't it? I have to be literal about it. It just doesn't seem like a very good idea. And so people say, you free marketeers, you're just such idealists about trade. This is all very impractical, what you're saying. I'm like, well, no, we're actually the ones presenting, basic self-interest here. You're the ones saying, well, we need to suffer too for the principle of the matter.
Yeah.
Just to stand up to the bully. It's important that we suffer. I don't really see the point of it, frankly. It's delusional.
The fight fire with fire analogy doesn't really work in this case. It's more like he's throwing a small burning object at our house, and we respond to that by burning down the house, so that he can't do it.
Yeah.
And the effects of tariffs have been laid bare this week in a slightly different field, so not necessarily directly linked to these specific tariffs, but British Steel is closing down its furnace in Scunthorpe, which is putting 2,700 jobs at risk, and I think it's will be the end of virgin steel making in the UK. One of the reasons that they say that they are doing this is sort of difficult market conditions, tariffs that are imposed on them, and then the cost of it's obviously a highly carbon intensive procedure, and the environmental costs that they have to bear because of that. So the question then comes, moving on to steel just briefly, what's the sort of free market answer to this? Because lots of people, first of all, do we need sort of sovereign steel capability?
Well, I don't know about that. I'm very skeptical of all of these sovereign abilities. I mean, it does seem to me that people are kind of talking up the prospect of total war with Russia, something that still strikes me as unlikely, needless to say, wildly undesirable. And I'm not sure the people who are talking up this prospect really believe it. Often it's a way of promoting other views that they have, like we should spend more on defense. Okay, maybe so. Like we need to have sovereign steel capacity so that we can repurpose all this stuff into bullets and tanks or whatever if that horrible moment occurred. it kind of feels like people thought that all along, and they've come up with another excuse to argue for it. So I'm very skeptical of these sovereign strategic capability stuff. Famously, France declared Danone a strategic industry because, of course, yogurt is very important. I mean, I like yogurt as much as the next man, perhaps even more so. But yeah, these things are very easily abused when you get down to them. I mean, I think the free market answer would more be a question. And I think the question would be, if we had a much more sensible energy policy, and if we had a tax system which didn't discriminate against investment to the degree that it does, which is much less than it used to, by the way, since the advent of full expensing, but there are still problems, and there's still a problem with business rates as well. If you fix those things, how much easier a life would these kind of heavy, capital-intensive, energy-intensive industries have in the UK? And that's basically what I want to explore before people come up with their modern industrial strategies to try and save particular industries or promote particular industries in the UK. I said, well, how about we just try and make policy more neutral towards these things instead of actively harmful towards them in the first place? And then if we still have a problem, and if you can convince me, and I'll take some convincing that we do need these particular strategic industries in the UK, well, then maybe we can have that conversation. But let's not put the cart before the horse. Let's fix all of these supply side problems first and then see where we are.
Yeah, I was just going to say that it's about that most of the time when bad news of that nature comes along, say a factory shutting down, that most people ask, what can the government do to help this? Whereas we're more likely to ask, well, what is the government currently doing that has made that situation worse? Get rid of that first. And I don't want to commit the same fallacy that you've just described, which is to say, okay, here's something that's in the news. Here's something that I've said all the time. This new event clearly shows that I've been right all along. But nonetheless, it is just fairly obvious that steel is an energy-intensive industry. And when you have some of the highest industrial energy costs in the world, well, that's going to have an impact on industries like that. And therefore, it is a good thing that net zero is now no longer as sacrosanct as it was until very recently. And of course, these are the consequences. If you deliberately make energy more expensive than it needs to be, and if that happens as a result of deliberate policy choices, then these are going to be the results, and it's not going to be cost-free.
People and markets respond to incentives and the system that you build, right? Which brings us nicely onto our last topic. A growing idea. We have a new spokesperson for the Corbynite left in a man called Gary Stevenson, who's been on the IEA podcast, Kristian, with you a couple of years ago, who was talking about a wealth tax. And so this idea of a wealth tax is taking off again. I think one of the specific proposals that I've seen is 2% charged on wealth over 10 million. But I'd like to ask the question about wealth taxes in the broader sense. Tom, what's the arguments for and against a wealth tax?
I don't think there's much of an argument for a wealth tax, so we can skip over that one pretty quickly. I'll let other people try and make the case for it and then poke holes. But I think it's a terrible idea. It's a truly, truly bad idea, a wealth tax. And I think it would be extraordinarily economically destructive if we went down this route in the UK. Can't imagine for a second that the government would actually consider it. But look, I think one of the reasons that people think, oh, well, that doesn't sound unreasonable, 2%. I mean, what's 2% to a billionaire? But you're not comparing like with like. So a wealth tax is a tax on a stock. It's not a tax on a flow like capital gains tax would be or dividend tax would be. And if you try and make those percentages equivalent, a 2% tax on a stock of wealth, which is growing at, say, 5% a year, is equivalent to taxing the return on capital at 40%. 40% equivalent to the higher rate of tax. But bear in mind, we're already taxing the return on capital in a variety of ways. So at the corporate level, 25% corporation tax. At the individual level, what are the top level? 39.5% on dividends, 24% on most capital gains with the changes that are coming in. Now, you can't simply add up marginal rates to create a total tax rate because you're kind of reducing the tax base at each stage of that process. Nevertheless, on those assumptions that I've outlined, you pretty quickly end up with 80% of the return on investment is being taken up in tax if you introduce a net wealth tax of this sort. Now, that's without accounting for inflation, by the way. So inflation will probably take another little nibble out of that bite as well. And I think you just have to ask yourself, if you were taxing the return on capital at 80% in the UK and other countries are available, who in their right mind is going to invest or start a business in Britain? And of course, it's not just about people who are very rich now. It's about anyone who might like to be really rich in future. We've already got a big problem, tens of thousands of millionaires leaving the UK. And we have a greater exodus than any country except China of rich people. Yeah, we have a stagnant economy. We talk about this all the time. Taxes, although the British tax system is not by any stretch the worst in the world, it's not by any stretch of the imagination one of the most competitive in the world either. And let's just go back to this specific proposal, right? The 2% tax on assets over 10 million every year. They say every year this will raise 24 billion. Now, it's just about plausible that if you did a one-off surprise wealth tax and caught everyone unaware, you would raise 24 billion in the first year. And they take a lot of their figures from a guy called Aaron Advani, who is at University of Warwick, and he's a good economist. And I don't agree with a lot of the stuff that he comes up with, but his research is serious, well put together research. But the whole point, and he and another guy at the LSE, Andy Summers, I think, did this UK wealth tax commission after COVID. And the idea was if we did a one-off wealth tax to kind of try and fill the big fiscal hole we had at the end of the pandemic, how would you structure it? How much tax could you raise? But their whole case was predicated on it being one-off. And so I know they've got this 24 billion figure from Aaron's tax calculator that came alongside that report. But if you read the report of that wealth tax commission, they say the evidence from other countries that have imposed net wealth taxes is that you lose, so for a 1% tax, you lose between 7 and 17% of your tax base every year that the tax is enforced, to tax one, basically to people changing their behaviour, to moving their investments overseas or whatever. So it might be 24 billion the first year. I still doubt it, but it's gonna fall pretty quickly. And that's just the wealth tax revenue. Think of the tax revenues you're losing elsewhere as a result of these people moving overseas, because we are in a progressive income tax system so reliant on the richest income taxpayers for a huge percentage of tax revenue. So I think this would be disastrous fiscally. I think it would be disastrous economically, and it would also just mark Britain out as basically an idiot country. To put it in rather brutal terms. And I know people are going to say, but Switzerland has a wealth tax. Okay, yes, Switzerland does have a wealth tax, but I don't think they have a capital gains tax, and I think they tax lots of other things at much lower rate. And they also, in some of the cantons, offer these kind of sweetheart deals where if you're rich enough, you can just agree how much tax you're going to pay, and that's the cost of living there. Fine. Switzerland, contrary to an old Niemietz meme, is not the answer to every question.
No, but they get so many other things right that they can really get away with a wealth tax. So if we can also get their healthcare system, their pension system, their level of decentralization, and their overall tax level and their overall ratio of public spending to GDP, then and if as a part of that package deal we get their wealth tax, then I say we should take it. But that is not really on the table right now. Otherwise, Switzerland is an unusual example in that particular respect, because wealth taxes were once, in the last century, a fairly common form of taxation. So lots of countries had net wealth taxes of one form or another. It's just that over time, most of them have abandoned them. I think there's now just 4 or 5 OECD countries left that still have something that you could describe as a wealth tax, and they've been abandoned for good reason. It was often that governments, including left-wing governments, just realized, okay, this tax raises barely any revenue. It has all these negative economic side effects, and it's also a bureaucratic nightmare to administer, because you have to issue that. If you tax a flow, of course, you can quite easily work out what the flow is. It's usually some easily verifiable number. Say it's a transfer from one person to another, and you can just apply a tax rate to that. With wealth, the stock has to be constantly re-evaluated. At the moment, if we wanted to introduce it, we wouldn't even know where to begin because we don't have a wealth registry. And that is usually the problem, that, okay, if somebody has all their wealth in stocks and bonds in a financial portfolio, that's easy enough. But quite often it's things that are harder to value, say property in a in a place where there aren't many transactions and you just don't know how much would you get if you were to sell that house today. And that was the issue with the West German wealth tax. That was the reason why it was declared unconstitutional, that they had this issue that for financial instruments, stocks and bonds, okay, fair enough, that works. But for property valuation, it was just fairly arbitrary, and that's an issue which would be, I guess, would be even more extreme in Britain. So that's already an issue with council tax, that it's still based on the value of 1991 of the property values, what they were then, and then just updated with inflation. For council tax, I guess that doesn't really matter, because that link to property wealth has become largely symbolic, and we just see it as a fee by the local council rather than as a property tax as such. For wealth tax, it would matter. So those are some of the reasons why countries that have previously had wealth taxes have abolished them in the main. So the trend has really been away from them, including under left-wing governments. And that's one of my problems with this wealth tax movement that has sprung up around Gary Stevenson, where I say this in his defense. We had, as you said, we've had him on this program. I think 3 years ago or so. He was a good faith debater, which I wasn't expecting. I was expecting him to do a Monbiot and just accuse us of being shills for the four corporate plutocrats. He didn't do that. He argued in good faith, and that's quite rare among leftists nowadays. But I did notice, as when I asked him a practical question, I think I brought up this example of the West German wealth tax that was then abolished for all the practical problems, and mentioned that it didn't bring in much revenue anyway. That there, once you bring up questions of that nature, he becomes evasive. He doesn't want to talk about that. He just goes back to saying, yes, but things were fine here in the 50s and 60s. Well, okay, here. To the extent that that's true, it was for completely different reasons. And that's also where he too quickly makes his wealth tax thing, he turns it into a theory of everything. He then starts talking about how his father, who is or was a postal worker, was able to afford a house in whatever, the 70s or so, and talks about how that isn't possible today. Well, all true. But that's got nothing to do with concentration of wealth. That happens for a completely different reason, and the mechanism is totally different. We also see so his argument is it's all these wealthy people buying up all the housing stock, but they don't. We have a very low rate of second home ownership. That's really not the reason. It can't be that.
I did look at, so Oxfam were involved, surprise, surprise, in this campaign as well, along with the Tax Justice UK. Big surprise there too. And I looked at a report that Oxfam had done, I think a year or two ago, calling for sort of wealth taxes globally. And one of their sort of metrics for assessing how high wealth tax should be is to basically keep billionaires' wealth constant so that it can't grow anymore. And I mean, maybe this is just illustrative. It made for nice, colourful charts and everything. But genuinely, I think this is the way that some people on the left think about things. It's not actually about making anybody better off. It's not really about redistribution. It is simply distaste at wealth and wealth growing. And they simply don't think that people deserve to be that rich. Like sort of from a purely sort of colloquial standpoint or whatever, I get that. But on the other hand, people say, well, you're rich enough already. Let's take Jeff Bezos, okay, the world's most successful bookseller. He was a billionaire from selling books. Did he really need to get any richer? And people will say, no, that's plenty for one man. Okay, well, you forget about all of the people he employs and all of the other businesses he goes on to start. But then, okay, we'll go into science fiction a bit here. Jeff Bezos' enormous wealth has allowed him to get into space exploration. But the point is, when people have enormous amounts of wealth, they're not just sitting on it for the most part. Maybe some are. But for the most part, this is invested in productive things, in new ventures, in things which make the rest of us richer and make our society just better off and, creates that sense of progress. And I think people just don't see that, right, on the left. And so they say they've got enough, we should take it, and we should give it to people who deserve it more. Unfortunately, that is just a horrible and I think completely destructive way to see the world.
I think you're completely right, obviously. And I think we've dealt with the wealth tax issue extremely efficiently and well there, and I'm sure that'll be the end of the discussion, so everybody else can stop talking about it. But that is all we've got time for, unfortunately. If you want more from us, then stay tuned for our podcasts next week and every week, and follow us on Substack at insider.iea.org.uk. And until next time, thank you very much.